Welcome, dear students, to the massive open online course on Political Economy 1. In our module today, we are going to discuss about women and the informal economy. We would first describe what exactly is an informal economy, and then we would try to understand the status of women in the informal economy. We will try to analyze the perspective of informal economy in India and the place of women in the context of the informal economy. Now, women have been working from time immemorial, but they have mostly been invisible in the development process. Much of women's work is mainly informal in nature. It is unrecognized and unpaid, and therefore does not enter into the many standard force and employment indicators. In the context of the Indian economy, the employment is overwhelmingly informal, and according to the Periodic Labor Force Survey, the PLFS survey of 2017-18, just before the pandemic, out of a total of 461 million employed persons, 415 million were involved in informal employment. Furthermore, informal employment is a great source of employment for all the women workers in India than the main workers. So here we see that number one, in the context of the Indian economy, informal employment is a huge one in our total employment scenario. And in the context of informal employment, the women workers are more than the male workers. Firstly, we come to the definition of the term of the informal economy. While the informal sector refers to informal enterprises, informal employment refers to informal jobs. So employment in the informal economy can be defined as a sum of employment in the informal sector and informal employment found outside the informal sector. We now need to understand what is the difference between informal jobs and informal employment. Let us look at this chart. In this chart, we have both informal jobs and formal jobs. Under the production units, we have informal sector enterprises. In the informal sector enterprises, we have the informal jobs denoted as A and the formal jobs in the informal sector enterprises denoted as B. While we have other production units, in the other production units also we have informal jobs which are denoted as C and the formal jobs which are denoted as D. So, if we have to calculate the persons in total informal employment, it will be A plus C, that is informal sector enterprises plus other production units, all of them who are employed in informal jobs comprises persons in informal employment. While if we look at the informal sector enterprises, which comprises of both of informal jobs and informal jobs, then A plus B will give us the total count of persons who are there working in the informal sector. C comprises of informal employment outside the informal sector, that is in other production units, while B is the formal employment in the informal sector. So if you have to look at the total employment in the informal economy, then we should have it as A plus B plus C, because D is formal jobs in other production units, which we are not going to count. So again, I am explaining this once more. Based on the above matrix, the informal economy comprises of informal employment, which means without any sort of secure contracts, worker benefits or social protections, and these are generally of two kinds. One is self-employment or self-employment in the informal enterprises, that is small, unregistered or unincorporated enterprises, including employers, own account operators, and unpaid contributing family workers. And we also have wage employment in informal jobs for informal enterprises, formal enterprises, households or no fixed employer, including casual or day laborers, industrial outworkers, unregistered or undeclared workers, and unprotected contract, temporary and part-time workers. In recent months, we have noticed that there has been an increase in attention that is paid to the informal workers. We have noticed this both in the policy circles and in the various forms of media, the social media and print media also. This I'm talking in the wake of the pandemic crisis. Some of these narratives have been positive. They have recognized the essential nature of informal work, which has come in front of people, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, such as the care management or waste management. However, there has also been a rise in panic about the supposedly unhygienic nature of informal work, with the informal workers being singled out as potential carriers of the COVID virus. Next, we also try to understand the measurement of informality. Now, these negative narratives that I have been saying, they're dismissive of informal work. That is not new, and maybe this is one of the reasons why it still persists, because informal work often remains invisible to the policymakers. As we already know, while countries are increasingly attempting to measure informal employment as a percentage or as a share of GDP, it often remains excluded from national indicators. Not only does this lead to an underestimation of the actual numbers, it also has much wide-reaching implications, including implications for poverty assessments, environmental assessments, because these assessments generally have to rely on the government statistics. As a result, whenever there is data deficit or data shortage for the government are unable to meet the needs of the undercounted and the invisible population. So if the government does not know what exactly is a measure of the total informality in the economy, it becomes very difficult for the government to basically design policies for these people, because they remain undercounted and they remain invisible in the eyes of the government. Critically, and likely as a consequence of some of the wider discourses, informal workers often find themselves that they themselves do not recognize the value of their work and contribution to the economy. So, like SEWA, the self-employed women's organization, and there is the International Center for Tax and Development, they have carried out work where it has often been seen that informal workers, and particularly women, they use language that devalues their own contribution to both their own households and the national economy. So this is a very, very disturbing trend where we find that women themselves are undervaluing the contribution of themselves to the society in the form of informal labor. So next we come to the context of women in the informal economy. Globally, informal employment is a great source of employment in the context of the whole world, where men is employed for around 63%, while in the context of women, it is around 58.1%. This is true for both the averages for the emerging and the developing countries and the developed countries, and for agricultural and non-agricultural informal employment. Out of the 2 billion workers in informal employment worldwide, just more than 740 million are women. And this global picture hides important disparities and the results from the influence of major countries such as China or the Russian Federation. By contrast, in low and the middle income countries, a higher proportion of women are in informal employment than men. In Africa, 89.7%, which is roughly around 90% of employed women are employed in the informal sector, in contrast to around only 82.7% of men. However, even though globally there are fewer women than men in informal employment, women in the informal economy are mostly found employment in various vulnerable situations. For instance, as domestic workers, home-based workers, or contributing family workers, while their male counterparts are generally employed in much better positions. Moreover, the lower the participation rate of women in the labor market, the lower the share of informal employment in total women's employment. This is particularly observed in certain countries like in the North African economies and in the Arabian states. So we see that from street vendors and domestic workers to subsistence farmers and seasonal agricultural workers, women make up a disproportionate percentage of workers in the informal sector. If we look at South Asia, over 80% of women in non-agricultural jobs are in informal employment. In sub-Saharan Africa, around 74% of women are in informal employment, while in the Latin American and in the Caribbean nations, it is around 54% women in informal employment. So working in this informal or grey economy, as it is sometimes called, leaves women without any protection of labor laws, social benefits such as pension, health insurance, or paid sick leave. They routinely work for low wages and in unsafe conditions, including risk of sexual and physical harassment. The lack of social protection has long-term impact on women. For example, fewer women receive pensions globally, and as a result, more and more of elderly women are living in poverty. Even in developed economies such as in France, Germany, Greece, and Italy, women's average pension is more than 30% lower than that of men in their economies. If we try to look at women's informal employment as a percentage of total employment, this chart shows this to us. We have South Asia, where around 95% of women are in informal employment as a percentage of total employment. 95% in South Asia, where of course India is the largest country there. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is around 89%, but much less than South Asia of 95%, while Latin American and the Caribbean, we have it at 59%. So women, for the most part, do not even see themselves as workers, even while shouldering a significant share of the household and the national economic activities. For instance, the female agricultural workers who work on family land frequently identify themselves not as workers but as housewives, even though the majority of the non-harvesting activities are done by these women. Similarly, home-based workers who bring in close to 40% of the family income often do not acknowledge their contribution to the supply chain, and this is compounded by the official lack of recognition of home-based work as trade by the national economy. So even when individuals do see themselves as workers, they discount their own agency and entrepreneurial ability. For instance, informal workers may describe their businesses as something they do just to survive or to eke out their living, and they do not consider that business to be quote-unquote real business. A vegetable vendor, suppose he owns his own cart, manages stock and supply, decides the pricing, decides the market, decides where he is going to take his vegetable cart to, hires employees to support them, and turns in a profit that allows them to scale up and buy another cart on a business loan with their existing cart as a collateral. And according to the definition of the trade, or the official definition, it is a nano business. However, such vendors often see themselves as subsistence workers. They do not consider themselves to be entrepreneurs. They consider their value in their own eyes as much less. However, the officials consider themselves as nano business units. So the lack of recognition and respect given to the informal workers not only shapes international and national policy discourse, but also embeds itself in the mindsets of the workers themselves. if the society does not give recognition and respect to the informal workers, they also tend to devalue themselves, devalue their self-esteem in their own eyes. So this is a very, very important point to keep in mind in terms of public policy, so that they also feel that they have a self-esteem and a respect in the type of profession, in the type of occupation that they are in. And we also understand the amount of contribution that these informal workers brings into the economy and society at large. We now go to informality and the key social indicators. Now, in presenting the linkages with social indicators, it is important to recall that the share of informal employment is highest among the low-income countries, and it is the lowest among the high-income countries. Specifically, the share of informal employment in total employment is only 18% in the developed countries and around 67% in the emerging economies, and astoundingly 90% in the less developed countries. So it is also important to highlight that developing countries have the highest rates of self-employment, especially own account workers and contributing family workers, while the developed countries have the lowest rate of self-employment and the highest rates of wage employment. So my first point here is poverty. Not all informal workers are from poor households, and not all formal workers are from non-poor households. However, there is a significant overlap between being informally employed and being poor. Higher percentages of informal workers than formal workers are from poor households in developed, emerging, and developing countries. Out of the 28 developing and emerging countries, the poverty rate of informal workers is at least twice than that of the formal workers in 19 countries. 5 times or more in 8 of these countries, and over 10 times as much in the 3 countries of Bulgaria, Colombia, and Romania taken together. Out of the 27 developed countries, the poverty rate of informal workers is twice that of formal workers in 22 countries and 5 times as much in one country, that's Slovenia. The close relationship between poverty and informality is also shown when comparing the percentage of workers from poor and non-poor households who are informally employed. In all of the developing and emerging countries, among workers from poor households, anywhere from just over 50% to as high as 98%, like in Cameroon and Rwanda, are informally employed. More than 80% of the workers from poor households are informally employed in 21 out of 28 countries. In developed countries, the percentage of informally employed range from 14% to 62% among workers from poor households and from 4% to 34% among workers from non-poor household. So in countries with high rates of poverty, women informal workers are more likely than the men informal workers to be from poor households, while women formal workers are less likely than male formal workers to be from poor households. This finding speaks of the intersection of gender and class in determining where women and men are employed in the labor force. The next variable that we will try to look into is the age. Globally, the share of informal employment in total employment is higher among the young workers, that is amongst the age group of 15 to 24 years, and older workers, that is in the age group of 65 and older, than amongst the adult age group, that is from 25 to 64 years of age. Amongst those who are employed, over 3/4 of both young and the older persons are informally employed, that is around 77% of young and the older workers. The shares among both the young and older workers are lowest in developed countries and they're very high in the developing countries, where 92% of young women workers and 87% of young men workers are informally employed, and 98% of older women workers and 95% of older men workers are informally employed. Across the regions, the difference between women and men in shares of informal employment by age are relatively small, within 2 percentage points in developed countries and from 0 to 6 percentage points in the emerging and the developing countries. The next variable of discussion is education. Everywhere and at all levels, global and regional, there is a clear link between an increase in the level of education of workers and a decrease in the share of informal employment. So whenever education rises, the number of years of education rises, the level of being engaged in the informal sector also declines. Globally, the rate of informal employment decreases with the level of education. From 94% of those who have no education, that is illiterate, it goes down to 85% among workers with primary education, to 52% for those with secondary education, to 24% for those with tertiary education. The difference in the rates of informal employment by level of formal education are higher in developing and emerging countries than in developed countries, which have a very low incidence of informality. While globally the percentage of women in informal employment is lower than men, the opposite is true among the low-educated workers. Among low-educated workers, women are more likely to be informally employed in developing, emerging, and the developed countries. Among women workers globally, 96% with no education and 86% with only primary education are informally employed. The comparative percentages of the men workers are 92% and 84% respectively. So among workers who have secondary or tertiary education, a lower percentage of women than men are informally employed except in the developing countries. In developing countries, it's the opposite. So it is important finally to note that while the relationship between formal education and informal employment is clear and telling, informal workers acquire knowledge, skills from the informal sources, including family or community, at the workplace, through informal apprenticeships, or by learning and doing. Now, Martha Chen, in her very important article in 2001, that is Women and Informality, a Global Picture, the Global Movements, in ACIS Review in 2001, mentions that fewer women than men hire labor, which means women are employees rather than employers. They are not employees themselves. Very few of them hire labor. Secondly, wages are lower in the informal sector as compared to the formal sector. And within the informal sector, women earn on an average a lower wage than men, with the gender wage gap being greater than in the formal sector. Thirdly, women are more visible in the lower value-added activities. So mainly they are employed in low-based occupation. Fourthly, the most invisible informal workers, namely the home-based producers, contribute the most to the global trade, as they form a significant share of the workforce in key export industries involving manual tasks or labor-intensive operations. And fifthly, the outsourcing of goods and services of the formal sector to the informal sector is increasing. obviously the question that confronts us is that why is it that even though the informal economy offers a lower wage than the formal economy, without any typical advantage of the formal economy such as a regular labor contract, health insurance, workers' benefits, pension schemes, etc., why are women more attracted toward the informal sector? Now, it's mainly because women are less able than men to compete in labor, capital and product markets because they have relatively low levels of education, skills, or are less likely to own property or have market know-how. And secondly, another explanation that Chen gives us is women's time and mobility are constrained by social and cultural norms that assign the responsibility of social reproduction to women and discourage investment in women's education and training. As a result, the women workers in the informal sector are easily hired, they're fired, cheapened and exploited. Here we have some state actions, a chart where I show you some state actions taken for women. Now, if we look at the regulation on organization to facilitate work-life balance, obviously, the state has taken certain actions in terms of giving women maternity leave and also a leave to take care of children, which is generally called the child care leave. Now, in terms of facilitating participation in decision making, we have fixing quotas for women in governing councils. We have creating state-sponsored organizations that focus on women's issues. These type of state actions can be taken. If we want to support pro-woman innovations, that can be done by creating innovations that reduce women's drudgery and creating innovation that improve women's health. These are very important state-focused actions. And if we want to incentivize women's integration as workers, we should give them tax breaks for organizations employing target percentage of women and minimum employee guarantee for women. These are certain state action that needs to be taken. Now, if we look at the Indian case, now current estimate places India's rate of female participation in the formal labor force at only 24%. And this is the lowest amongst the lowest in the developing nations. So majority of Indian women then must be working in the informal sector in jobs which has got limited social protection and very low wages. So it is estimated that the Indian economy could grow by an additional 60% by 2025, adding around $2.9 trillion if women were represented in the formal economy at the same rate as men. So India stands to benefit more from women's economic inclusion than any other nation in the world, and its government recognizes this potential. Recently, the Indian government has introduced economic reforms that explicitly take gender into account, from how women allocate their time to how they access markets and the financial assets. The Indian government have enacted an expansive worker protection program. We all know this, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which is the MNREGA, that requires equal wages be paid to both men and women and include provisions for child care at work sites. In addition, in March 2017, India had enacted a federal law mandating that all employers should offer 26 weeks of paid maternity leave. India has also led the way with savings and credit association groups, which we all know as the self-help groups, SHGs. SHGs exist across the Indian economy and consist of groups of women who are lending to one another. With more than 8 million groups across India, the government is now using SHGs as a delivery channel for government services aimed at women. These efforts could be bolstered by initiatives to help women transition from working in the informal economy to leading small and medium-sized businesses, which have been shown to fuel economic growth. Now, financial inclusion is another very important thing. India has also taken steps to advance women's financial inclusion through its Aadhaar program. And we all know that the Aadhaar program is the largest digital national identification initiative undertaken anywhere in the world. More than 99% adults are now covered by Aadhaar, which relies on fingerprints and iris scans to create a national identity base. Now, women can open bank account using Aadhaar's biometric information that tells the financial institutions who they are. Thus, India has created a digital identification technique that has coincided with the digitalization of banking and makes last mile banking possible, especially for women. A biometric method of identification makes it almost impossible for men to unilaterally access money in their wives' bank accounts and potentially spend it on non-household item, especially liquor or alcohol. Despite these efforts, however, an overwhelming and growing majority of Indian women work outside the formal economy and therefore fall outside the government protection. Current estimate places India's rate of female participation in the formal labor force at only around, as I have just said, 34%, a rate that has actually declined over the past decade across education levels and in both the urban and the rural areas. While I conclude this, we can just say that the majority of the Indian women are working in the informal sector, and so we should have laws that impede women's economic participation in the formal labor force, and Indian women have equal rights to obtain jobs, sign contracts, open bank accounts. According to the International Labour Organization, cultural barriers and occupational segregation do play an important role in limiting women's income or economic potential, as women in India tend to be grouped into industries and occupations that have not seen employment or wage growth in the past years or in the recent years. So India needs more policies that support women workers and promote investment in services and skills training for informal laborers that would add value to their activities. Women affiliated with BASIX, BASIX, which is a livelihood promotion institution. Women affiliated with SEVA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. With Ujjivan, a financial service provider to the economically active poor. They cite persistent cultural barriers and stigma about women's work as barriers to economic participation. They also advocate for further government actions or efforts to train women, including those presently working in the informal economy, for industries and occupations that are experiencing growth. Private sector companies and non-governmental organizations, we have various private sector companies like Walmart and the IKEA Foundation. They have tried to attempt to fill many of these gaps for their employees by providing women with skill training and access to savings and credit, childcare, amongst others. Yet, the reach of these programs is very limited, and ILO findings confirm market rigidity prevents many women in the informal sector from transitioning into the formal economy.